The wind howled across the cliffside, carrying with it the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. Eleanor Finch stood on the narrow platform of Hallowmere's coastal station, her suitcase by her side. The sea below churned with restless waves, battering the jagged rocks. She had not planned to come here, yet the letter had left her no choice. It had arrived 3 days ago, sealed with an unmarked red wax, the handwriting old-fashioned and precise. Come to Hallowmere. The last bell will ring again. It will call the ones we lost. No name, no return address. Only a date and the time, 11 o'clock at night. Eleanor's interest in forgotten histories had led her to stranger places before, but something about the letter unsettled her. It felt less like an invitation and more like a warning. She had read about Hallowmere in passing, its fishing industry, its decline, and the mysterious night in 1892 when 20 men had vanished after a shipwreck. But what caught her attention most was a detail buried in a century-old newspaper. The church bell, which had long been silent, had rung without pause until dawn the morning after the disaster. The station master, an elderly man with a weathered face, eyed her as she passed. "You here for the sea, miss, or the stories?" he asked. "Perhaps both," Eleanor replied, forcing a polite smile. His gaze followed her for a moment too long. "Careful which you find. Some of them don't let go." The village lay in a hollow between cliffs, its narrow lanes twisting towards the shore. Weather-beaten cottages leaned into the wind, their roofs patched with slate. Eleanor found her lodging, a small room above the harbour inn. From the window, she could see the ruins of the old church on the far edge of the village, its bell tower long collapsed into the grass. That evening, as dusk bled into night, she walked to the church. The air grew colder with each step. The ruin was eerily still, only the rustle of long grass and the faint hiss of the tide in the distance. She placed her hand on the crumbling stone, imagining the bell that once hung above, summoning villagers for worship, and perhaps, on that fateful night, for something else entirely. Then she heard it. A single, deep chime. It seemed to vibrate in her bones, low and resonant, though there was no bell in sight. She turned sharply, scanning the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, from the shadows between the broken walls, a figure stepped forward. Moonlight spilled across the grass, silvering the broken stones of the church. The man stood just beyond the shadows, his coat long and dark, his face pale in the cold glow. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. "Are you Eleanor Finch?" His voice was low, carrying easily in the still air. Eleanor hesitated. "Yes." "And you are?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "You came because of the bell." "I came because of a letter." She kept her voice steady, though her pulse had quickened. He studied her for a moment, then glanced towards the empty bell tower as if expecting it to appear. "They always send for someone before it happens again." The words sent a chill through her. Before what happens again? But the man had already turned away, walking towards the far wall of the ruin. He touched a moss-covered stone, tracing something carved into it. Eleanor followed, squinting in the dim light. The inscription was old, worn almost smooth, but she could still make out the faint outline of names she recognized from her research. The men lost at sea in 1892. "They never found their bodies," the man said quietly. "But every time the bell rings, one of them returns." Eleanor frowned. "Returns? You mean they're ghosts?" He gave her a look that was unreadable. "Not always ghosts." Before she could press him for more, the wind rose sharply, rattling the grass. The air felt charged, almost electric. Then, from somewhere deep in the ruin, the bell tolled again. This time, it did not stop. The sound rolled over the village, low and mournful, as if pulled from the bottom of the sea. Eleanor's skin prickled. Lights flickered on in distant cottages. Somewhere nearby, a dog began to howl. The man's eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the church walls. "It has begun," he murmured. "And you are already part of it." From the edge of the cliff, a figure was watching them. The figure stood motionless against the wind, its outline blurred by the shifting mist from the sea. For a moment, Eleanor thought it was a trick of the moonlight. But then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, turning away from the cliff and disappearing into the darkness beyond the path. Eleanor started forward, but the man caught her arm. His grip was firm, almost urgent. "Don't follow," he warned. "Not tonight." "Why?" "Who was that?" she asked. He glanced towards the path, his jaw tightening. "One of the ones who return." Her mouth went dry. She wanted to dismiss it as superstition, yet something in his tone held the weight of truth. The bell's mournful toll still rang through the night, steady and unyielding. Back at the inn, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The sound of the bell seemed to seep through the walls, its vibration faint but constant. She sat by the window, looking out at the harbor. The water was restless, shifting in unnatural patterns beneath the moonlight. Just after midnight, movement caught her eye. Down by the shoreline, a lone figure was walking barefoot along the wet sand, their head bent as if searching for something. The tide lapped hungrily at their ankles, but they did not flinch. The next morning, she asked the innkeeper if there had been a late fisherman out on the beach. "No one goes near the shore after dark," the woman said, her expression tightening. "Not since the wreck." Eleanor leaned in slightly. "What wreck?" The woman hesitated, glancing towards the empty street outside. "You'll hear the stories soon enough. But some of them walk the sands still." Later that day, Eleanor returned to the ruins, determined to find the man from the night before. She searched the grounds, but there was no sign of him. Only the faint impression of footprints in the damp earth, prints that led towards the cliff's edge and then stopped abruptly, as though the person had vanished into the air. The tide below was high and violent, yet over its roar, Eleanor thought she heard it again. A single, deliberate chime. And this time, it sounded as though it came from beneath the waves. The morning air was sharp with salt and rain when Eleanor climbed the narrow path towards the village archives. The building was small, a squat stone structure with a slate roof that glistened from the drizzle. Inside, the scent of dust and paper hung thick in the air. She found the archivist, a woman with grey hair pulled into a tight knot, sorting through a stack of ledgers. "I'm looking for records about the wreck of 1892, Eleanor said. The woman paused mid-turn of a page. "That's a dark chapter for Hallowmere." "All the more reason for me to understand it," Eleanor replied. Reluctantly, the archivist led her to a locked cabinet. She produced a brass key from her apron pocket, the metal cold to the touch, and opened the doors. Inside were bundles of yellowed papers tied with fraying twine, along with a thin leather-bound journal. Eleanor untied the first bundle and found a newspaper article. The headline was bold and grim, 20 lost as the sea claims the Larkspur. The article told of a violent storm that had smashed the fishing vessel against the rocks just beyond the bay. Search parties found wreckage and scattered nets, but no bodies. The journal belonged to the church's former sexton, Thomas Weaver. His writing was hurried, his lines uneven. One entry caught Eleanor's eye. "The bell tolled itself tonight. No rope pulled, no hand touched the clapper. It rang for hours as the wind screamed. I saw them in the foam, faces pale, eyes black as pitch. And when the tide retreated, they stood upon the sand." Eleanor read the line twice, her pulse quickening. The archivist spoke softly behind her. "We don't open those records often. People think reading them invites attention." "What kind of attention?" Eleanor asked. The woman's eyes flicked towards the window, where the mist pressed against the glass. "The kind that follows you home." Later, walking back through the lanes, Eleanor noticed she was being shadowed. A tall man in a fisherman's coat lingered at the end of the street, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Each time she turned, he was there, never closer, never farther. By the time she reached the inn, the bell was silent. But as she closed her door, a drop of seawater slid from the keyhole and fell onto the floorboards. That night, the fog came in thick from the sea, swallowing the village until even the nearest lamplight was a blurred glow. Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her room, the journal of Thomas Weaver open before her. She traced the words with her fingertip, reading them again and again, as though repetition might unlock their meaning. A sound interrupted her thoughts. Soft. Rhythmic. Footsteps. They were coming from the corridor outside her door. Slow, deliberate, the boards creaking under each step. She held her breath as they stopped right outside her room. The silence that followed was heavier than the fog outside. Then, 3 knocks. Eleanor rose, heart hammering. "Who is it?" she called. No reply came, only the faint hiss of the wind beyond the window. She unlocked the door and opened it. The corridor was empty. But the floorboards were wet, glistening as though someone had walked in straight from the sea. A trail of water led down the hallway and stopped at the far wall, where no door stood, only bare plaster. Uneasy, Eleanor stepped back into her room and locked the door again. She moved to the window for air, but the fog was so dense she could see nothing beyond the glass. Then, in the whiteness, a face appeared, pale, gaunt, eyes black as coal. It lingered only a second before the fog closed over it. The next morning, she decided to confront the man she had met in the ruins. She found him by the harbor, staring at the tide. "You didn't tell me everything," she said. "I told you enough to make you leave," he replied without looking at her. "But you stayed." He turned to her then, his expression grave. "The ones who return aren't always what they were. Sometimes, they come back wrong." Before she could respond, a shout rose from the quay. Fishermen were gathered at the shoreline, pointing to something tangled in the nets that had washed in with the morning tide. It was a man's coat. Heavy, salt-stiffened, and inside the pocket, a church bell clapper, slick with seawater. The wind howled down the narrow streets as Eleanor hurried towards the boarding house where she had taken a small room. Her mind was a tangle of questions, about the letter, the sketch, and most of all, the mysterious man who had disappeared into the crowd at Whitby Pier. The boarding house was warm, its lamps glowing faintly through lace curtains. Mrs. Hargreaves, the landlady, was dozing in her chair by the fire. Eleanor slipped upstairs, grateful for the privacy of her small, dimly lit room. On the table by the window lay the envelope she had received earlier that morning. She picked it up again, running her fingers over the paper. The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned, with the faint scent of sea salt clinging to it. She whispered aloud, "What mistake? And why now?" Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint tapping at the glass. She froze, heart thudding. Slowly, she turned to see a shadow moving just beyond the window. The curtain fluttered as if stirred by more than the wind. Eleanor stepped closer, peering through the glass. The street outside was empty, except for a small folded piece of paper, wedged between the sill and the frame. With trembling hands, she pulled it free. There were only 4 words written in the same elegant script. "He doesn't know yet." A shiver ran down her spine. Who didn't know? And what would happen when he found out? The floorboard creaked somewhere in the hallway. Eleanor's eyes darted to the door. And the handle began to turn. By the time we reached the narrow staircase leading to the attic, the air felt thick, too heavy for such a cold, drafty house. Edward's steps slowed, and I could hear the hesitation in his breathing. "Are you certain about this?" he whispered, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Yes," I replied firmly, though my voice was lower than I intended. "Whatever's been hidden here, it's time we saw it." The wooden stairs creaked under our weight. At the top, the attic door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of pale light spilling into the gloom of the landing. My hand hovered over it for a moment, but before I could push it open, a faint sound came from inside, a rhythmic, dragging movement, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Edward's hand closed around my arm. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. "We're not alone up here." Pushing the door open, we stepped into the attic. Dust hung in the air like mist, and the single window was streaked with grime. Old trunks and covered furniture crowded the room, but what drew my eyes immediately was the far corner, where a heavy, weathered chest sat open, its lid propped against the wall. A man was crouched beside it. Not just any man, his face was unmistakable. The same face from the faded photograph I'd found earlier in the parlor. He looked up at us, eyes wide, as if we'd caught him mid-crime. In his hands, he clutched a bundle of yellowed letters. "You shouldn't be here," he said hoarsely, his voice trembling but defiant. "This house doesn't belong to you. It never did." Before I could speak, Edward stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man gave a bitter smile. "I'm the one who's been keeping the truth from you. And once you know it, you'll wish you'd never come to Ravensmoor." The floorboards groaned as he rose to his feet, and behind him, something in the chest gave a muffled thump, as if whatever was inside wanted to get out. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the narrow drawer of the old dressing table. The wood groaned in protest, the faint scent of lavender and dust escaping into the air. At first, there were only neatly folded handkerchiefs, a silver hairbrush, and a string of pearls dulled by time. But beneath them, hidden away as though deliberately concealed, lay a small, leather-bound photograph case. She lifted it, her pulse quickening. The case was warm despite the chill in the room, as though someone had held it recently. Snapping the clasp open, she found a sepia-toned photograph inside, a young woman, perhaps 20, standing on the steps of Ravensmoor's west wing. Her features were striking, but what made Clara's breath catch was not the woman herself. It was the man beside her. It was Henry. But he looked younger, decades younger, his hair darker, his eyes unlined by age. His arm rested protectively around the woman's shoulders, his gaze fixed on her as though the photographer didn't exist. Clara stared at the image, her thoughts in disarray. Henry had spoken little of his past, and certainly never of another woman. Was this a relative? An ancestor? Or had Henry been far less truthful than she had believed? She turned the photograph over. In faded ink, a line was scrawled, "To my dearest Eleanor. Yours always, H." The floorboard behind her creaked. Clara spun round, but the doorway was empty. A gust rattled the window pane. Her grip tightened on the photograph as a sudden realization gripped her. If someone else was in the house, they would not want her holding this. And they might be watching her even now.